Hey everyone, welcome back to JP's Budget Collecting and our weekly look back at the hot comics from 6 months ago. This week we're looking back at the hot comics from December 8th, 2023. I'm recording this on June 7th, 2024. As always, those dates are so you know when this information is actually most relevant because the market is always moving and changing. Also, as always, we're looking back at the Comic Tom Key Collector Hottest Trending Comics of the Week and the CBSI Hot Top 10. Those are the two lists I've been using now for over 5 years to kind of get a feel for what was hot in the market and how did those books respond after whatever made them hot. So we come back 6 months later, see how they're doing in the market, see if you should have been patient, and then figure out what factors affected books that continue to go up, what factors were affecting books that dropped, so that we can all make better decisions about what books we chase and what books we're patient on. So, without further ado, we got 17 books to talk about between the two lists. Let's dig in and see what we can find out. First up, we got Stray Dogs, number 1, back on the list for the first time in a very long time, since the series was coming out. This book from 2021 was back on the list because it was supposedly production had started back up after all the strikes and everything. And raw copies were back up to 15 to 20, 9.8, 50 to 75, which was kind of still at the floor, just lots of sales there, kind of just propping this book back up because it had fallen completely, after being a $300 9.8, it had fallen completely off everyone's radar. Now it's a $20 to $40 book, 60 to 80 on a 9.8, so I guess up and worth it because of the raw sales are definitely up, but yeah, we'll see if this ever becomes anything again that people really chase, but for now, it is back up slightly. Next, we have Monster in My Pocket, number 1. This hit the list because a live-action production was announced. $15 to $20 back then, now it's $10 to $20. So yeah, we'll see what this becomes. This was kind of more about figures and that kind of stuff, toys back in the 80s, or I guess 90s actually, but late 80s, early 90s. But yeah, so supposedly we're getting some sort of movie production here. We'll see if it amounts to anything. But so far, it's pretty steady, although you definitely call and I'll be back because there are some cheap sales here. Next, we have Biker Mice from Mars. Say that one 3 times fast. This was hitting the list again because it was back in production by Ryan Reynolds. I think this goes on and hits the list a couple more times here in the next month or so. $20 back then, 9.8 for $2.15. Now it's a $10 to $25 book. Most recent 9.8 sale, $125. So that's a trap on that 9.8 sale, but not very many. But basically, that's one sale. A ton of sales on the raw side, and they're definitely down, and I'll be back on that. So that's where we're going to stick with this versus trap. But yeah, definitely this book is backed up, even though it's still in production. Next, we have Mad Max Fury Road, Furiosa, number 1. The first appearance of Furiosa, and this hit the list because the trailer dropped back then. Now, the movie has just recently come out, so you think, oh, maybe the book's actually up. This one's actually up. Not really. Back then it was 15 to 30 for raw copy, 9.8, 115 to 135. Now raw copies are 15 to 25, 9.8, 75 to 150. So basically just very steady. This is all, I mean, I'm going to call I'll be back because there are a few deals to be had. But yeah, this has been super steady compared to where it was when the trailer dropped. Movie just dropping. We're right in the same price range, which probably means a few months from now, you'll be able to get it for even less. Next, we have Doctor Who, number 1. This was hitting the list because we were getting a Doctor Who special, which was leading to the new Doctor, which was coming out on Disney Plus. The whole thing was being added to Disney Plus. So this hit the list. This is the first U.S. series of Doctor Who in the comics, not its first comic appearance in the U.S. But anyway, $20 back then, 9.8 for $100, and now it's a $5 to $20 book with a 9.8, still going for right at 100. That's multiple sales right at 100. But overall, we're going to call this down, and I'll be back just because of the raw sales. You can get raw copies, a ton of raw copies, pretty nice, looking for like $10. So, all right, still more option show movie kind of stuff here that's not Marvel and DC with The Last of Us, American Dreams, number 1. And this hit the list because season 2 was starting to film. So we got news that they were starting to work on that. So yeah, raw copies were 150, 9.8 jumped back up to 940. This was once a $1,500 book during season 1 coming out for 9.8. Now it's $250 to $300, so raw copies are actually going for more, and that is multiple sales than they were back then. But our most recent 9.8 is down around $780, so 9.8s have dropped back a little bit. Raw copies have progressed forward. You could argue maybe up. We're just going to go steady and worth it here. Basically, if you invested in this book in the last 6 months, you're probably doing okay. And my guess is when season 2 comes out, you might be able to make a little bit off of it. But yeah, book's still going for big money, just not nearly those season 1 values. All right, with that, we're going to move into one of our 3 covers this week. We have Venom, number 28, the Art Adams 1 in 25. Back then, this was a $30 to $35 book, which is not a great sign for 1 in 25. Usually means it's going to end up under ratio. That is the case here. $20 now. 9.8, 30 to 80. So we're going to call this down in a trap. I mean, 9.8s, yeah, are basically going for starting at less than what it takes to slab them. So, yeah. So, down in a trap on this one. It has definitely backed up and has not... One of the Art Adams that has not sustained any kind of value or momentum, which I kind of get. I never thought that was a particularly attractive Venom cover. Next, we have Miles Morales, number 12, the David Baldeón 1 in 25. This was a $50 to $60 book, so right at double ratio for this one, which also usually ends up being a trap because it usually ends up being between ratio and double ratio, and that's what's happened here. It's a $25 to $55 book, with most of the sales being under 50, more in the 30 to 40 range. 9.8, only 70 to 100, so definitely a trap on this one. Yeah, just doing a typical 1 in 25 thing for that gets to 50 to 60. This is usually almost exactly what happened here. Our last cover is an older cover. We got Amazing Spider-Man 313, the Todd McFarlane Lizard variant. And basically, this was hitting the list because there was a spike in sales, but mostly because the Mark Jewelers went for like $1,600. No really recent Mark Jewelers to compare this to, but right now, back then, raw copies were $15, and 9.8 went for $92. Now it's a $5 to $15 book, 9.8, 75 to 80. So now I'll be back on this one. Yeah, like I said, I couldn't find a Mark Jewelers to compare to. Interestingly, that's a much bigger difference between a Mark Jewelers and just a regular 9.8 than you would typically see. So I don't know if this is particularly rare to find a Mark Jewelers of this one. I don't know exactly what was going on there. All right, next we got it. We're gonna move into some Sony Spider stuff, and then there's Spider-Man Noir number 1 hitting the list because we had news that they had a showrunner attached to do the show. This was back when we didn't know for sure Nicolas Cage was going to happen, but it has happened. We're getting the live action. And this is when we found out we got a showrunner, the same one that did the Punisher show. So this was $150 to $200 back then, which really wasn't up much. $470 to $575 for a 9.8. Now it's $200 to $300, 9.8, $5 to $525. So 9.8 sitting in the same range, but up, worth it on those raw copies, maybe even up in straight cash on the raw copies. This book is, and most of that's just because we got a lot of confirmation about this just in the last month or so related to Nicolas Cage and when the timeline for this was and a lot of other stuff. So that is why this has continued to go very well for this particular book. Plus, this book has just been popular steady. It's one of the Spider variants that people have latched onto and continue to chase and buy. Next, we got X-Men Adventures number 1, the first comic for the 90s cartoon. Obviously, back then, we got the release date for the series is what prompted it to hit the list. And, of course, we've just recently come off that show. That show just finished. Back then, it was an $18 book raw on average, 9.8, 185. Now it's a $5 to $25 book, 9.8, 150 to 225. So this has been very steady, very worth it. Notice though it didn't really jump up, even though we just got the series. It stayed very much steady right where it was at. But yeah, everyone loved X-Men 97. Looking forward to more seasons. Next, we have Uncanny X-Men number 221, first appearance of Mr. Sinister. And there was a couple things going on here. First, everyone's suspecting he was going to be a big part of that X-Men 97 that we got the release date for. Plus, John Hammond made a comment that he'd be interested in playing Mr. Sinister in a live-action way. So, it caused a lot of people to chase this book back then. 65 to 75 for a raw copy, 9.8, 285, both of which were a little higher than has been typical for this book. 15 to 80 now for a raw copy, 9.8, 190 to 260. So we're going to call it steady. I'll be back. Definitely some bargains here. You could almost call down on the raw side, but we'll just call it steady. This book has bounced around a lot over the last 3 years, mostly though in this kind of range that we're talking about here. Next, we have Uncanny X-Men number 239. First cover, second appearance of Mr. Sinister. Back then, raw copies were going for 40, 9.8, 120 to 140. Now it's a $10 to $25 book, 9.8, 175 to 200. So another down, and I'll be back on this in this case. This one has actually backed up, even though we just got the show, more so than his first appearance. And even though we got the other part of this key, which was the Madeline Pryor stuff, still backed up. Next, we have Fantastic Four, number 48 on the list for second or third week in a row, with all the Silver Surfer rumors that were going on. 6.0 back then was 1,500 to 1,850, and 8.0 hit 4,600. Interestingly, an 8.0 is actually down to 3,300, where 6.0s now are up to 2,000 to 2,200. Raw copies for this book, like in the conditions that have sold recently, 4 to 1,200. Obviously, a high grade raw would go for even more. Overall, just looking across different grades and that kind of stuff, this has been pretty steady and worth it over the last 6 months. Obviously, long term, this is a straight cash book. But really haven't, despite all the FF news and that kind of stuff, this book hasn't really moved a ton upward. Some grades have moved up more than others, but it's mostly been kind of steady worth it with slight gains. Next, we have Silver Surfer number 1, first Silver Surfer solo and his origin. Raw copies back then, 150 to 1050, a 9.4 for 10,400 was the one they put on the list. Now a raw is $70 to $1,000, so basically the exact same range. No recent high grade sales up toward this 9.4 value, so nothing there. Overall, this is another one that's been pretty steady and worth it over the last 6 months, looking across grades and that kind of stuff. All right, next we have Uncanny X-Men number 212. First battle of Sabretooth and Wolverine, and this hit the list because we had leaked photos from Deadpool 3 that appeared to show Sabretooth, and later just his head. So yeah, that's what caused us to hit the list. Raw copies were going for 30 and 9.8 going for 300. Now it's a $5 to $30 book, 9.8, 250 to 300. So we'll call this a down, and I'll be back. This movie is coming very, very soon, and I know people are super psyched for it. We will see if it lives up to the hype, hopefully. And then our last book is Iron Fist number 14, first appearance of Sabretooth, again, because of those Deadpool photo leaks. Raw copies back then, 125 to 400, 9.8, 3,900. Recent raw sales are 1 to 600. That high end has to do with just a high grade one going. 9.8, 35 to 36, so a slight step back on the 9.8. Overall, we'll just call it steady, and then I'll be back. Very much in the same kind of range that it's been going the whole time. So that's this week's list. We had a lot of books that were steady, but we had a lot, in some ways, more books with a longer track record that helped sustain all those steady books. A few ups than we typically do. So that's why we did a little better this week, I think, than we don't normally do. But I want to thank you guys for watching, and we will catch you next time. Later.